All right, everybody, I think we're live and people are filing in right about now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Gaurav Dubey, the content editor over at Microdose Psychedelic Insights. And we are so pleased to present our first custom event series, leveraging the platform strengths of our psychedelic operating system to produce this Mydecine speaker series, Psychedelic Solutions event. So Mydecine trades on the CSX under MICO, the OTC under MICO-F, and the FSC under ONFA. The Mydecine Innovations Group is an emerging biopharma and life sciences company committed to the research, development, and acceptance of alternative nature-sourced medicine for mainstream use. Mydecine has three core focuses: developing a robust portfolio of intellectual property through cutting-edge research initiatives, clinical trials focusing on veterans, EMS, and first responders with a PTSD indication, modern technology utilizing its own digital telehealth platform for better clinical trial management and mental health well-being. To achieve these initiatives, Mydecine has assembled a world-class team of global scientific and medical experts and have today brought together 4 members to review how cutting-edge research is igniting mainstream medical interest to unlock the potential of psychedelic therapies. I have the pleasure of introducing our wonderfully talented moderator today, Yeji Lee. Yeji is a journalist at Business Insider, where she focuses on the cannabis and psychedelics industries. At BI, Yeji has covered the burgeoning psychedelic space as it's garnered more interest from traditional biotech investors and Canadian banks alike over the past year. She's profiled top executives from companies like Compass and Atai and has written about the emerging trends in the industry, as some companies have geared up to go public and others have laid out the groundwork to gain FDA approval on psychedelic-based treatments. Yeji joined Business Insider after graduating from Columbia University School of Journalism. She was raised between South Korea and Canada and is now based in New York. And now I have the pleasure of handing the mic over to her. And I think all our panelists are now here. So take it away, Yeji, and thank you all so much. Have a wonderful event series.
Thanks for the intro. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel. Today, we'll be discussing how cutting-edge research is igniting mainstream medical interest to unlock the potential of psychedelic therapies. This is the first part of the Mydecine Speaker Series by Mydecine Innovations Group. And before I introduce our panelists, I'd like the audience to know that you can ask us questions. There should be an option for you to send them in through your browser. The first 60 minutes of the panel will be focused on the speakers, and the last half hour will be reserved for questions from the audience. So feel free to send those in as they come up, and we'll get to those later on. To introduce today's panelists, we have Dr. Ruth Lanius, Professor of Psychiatry and the Director of PTSD Research at the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Rakesh Jetly, Chief Medical Officer for Mydecine Innovations Group, Robert Roscow, Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Mydecine Innovations Group, and last but not least, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris, Head of the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. Now, before we dive into the questions, I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves really quickly, and just starting from who's first on my screen. Why don't we start with you, Ruth?
Hi, everyone. I'm a clinician scientist and professor of psychiatry at Western University. I've spent the last 2 decades researching what happens in the brain, mind, and body in individuals who have been traumatized. I'm also involved in treatment of post-traumatic stress, and I see clients regularly. And I'm really interested in expanding my integrative treatment approach and learning new methods that can help my patients. And that's why.
All right, great. Thanks, Ruth. And Robert, why don't you go next?
Excellent, thanks. So really happy to be here. I'm Robert Roscow, the CSO of Mydecine Innovations Group. And we really, started Mydecine to take advantage of and build on the foundation of the changing climate of understanding and interest in psychedelic medicine. So really excited to be on the panel today to talk about, how research is really, helping move that forward. Thanks.
All right, Rakesh, you next.
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Rakesh Jetly, I'm a psychiatrist, and Ruth and I have been in this sort of trauma business for about the same time. We trained at the same time in Ontario. I've a little different path. I've been a psychiatrist with the Canadian Armed Forces for about 20 years, a family doc with the military before that. So my commitment has been sort of as a clinician scientist, trying to understand PTSD and the effects of trauma on soldiers and veterans. And this transition into sort of MICO in this position is ideal because we really want to understand and explore new options for veterans and military people and first responders that are suffering from PTSD, and try to understand what's happening in the brain and in the body as we try these new treatments.
Thanks, Rakesh. And Robin, do we have you? I think we may have lost Robin. We can go back to that. We can go back to Robin's intro really quickly later on. Why don't we just get started with the first question here? I'm going to pose it to all of you, so whoever wants to jump in, please feel free. Just to get to the main topic of this panel, how have recent studies shed light on both mental illness and the function of psychedelics as treatment? Oh, hey, Robin, do we have you? Robin, can you hear us okay?
Hi, I've had a couple of, I had some internet issues.
Oh no, can you hear us okay now?
I think he's frozen.
Yeah, I think Robin may still be having internet issues. Why don't we jump into the question, and then once that's resolved, we can go back. But just to repeat my question again, to get to the heart of the main topic of this panel, how have recent studies shed a new light on both mental illness and the function of psychedelics as treatment? Oh. What technologies and methods in particular have had a really big impact on the field? Ruth, why don't we start with you, and then we can just open it up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think there's some really exciting developments that have occurred over the last few years, both in terms of psilocybin as well as MDMA. And I think they've shown some really promising effects in PTSD and depression. And I think these are effects we cannot ignore. Also, from a personal experience, I've had some clients who've tried a lot of therapeutic modalities, but have found the psychedelic treatments most beneficial. That's not for all, but that's certainly for some. And along these clinical investigations, we've also learned that the psychedelics, and today we're focusing on psilocybin, can have a really important effect on how the brain functions. And I think what we often see in psychiatric disorders is that the brain gets locked in certain patterns. And I think that really promotes the distress individuals feel. And there's the hypothesis, of course, that the psychedelic treatments can push people out of these locked places in the brain and really reset the brain. And so I'm very excited to see, and of course this relates to Robin's research, that the brain network called the default mode network, which is really involved with how we see ourselves in the world, which is of course so affected when somebody's traumatized and is depressed, right? Often people see themselves as worthless, as useless, and veterans and military members often also have what's called moral injury, and they experience a lot of guilt and shame. And of course, that also really affects how they view themselves in this world. And the fact that we've seen psilocybin be able to affect the brain network that really underlies how we view ourselves in this world, I think is very exciting. And I look forward to studying this in response to giving individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder who are veterans, to really follow their brain trajectory over their treatment with psilocybin.
Robin, is your internet working well now?
So,
Perfect.
literally, the technician came just as this was starting, so I'm sorry if there have been some hiccups there.
That's okay. We are just on the first question here, but before we sort of move on and open that up to the rest of the panelists, Robin, why don't you give a quick introduction of yourself, and then I can repeat that first question again, so you just hear it.
Sure. My name is Robin Carhart-Harris. I head up the Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. I've been researching psychedelic drugs in a sense since I started my PhD in 2005, so about 15 years. I've done a series of brain imaging studies with a range of different psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, if that's defined as a psychedelic, and DMT, and also a couple of clinical trials in depression, including a recent double-blind randomized control trial comparing psilocybin with escitalopram for major depressive disorder. Other research as well, but I think that's probably enough for now. Pleased to be with you.
Great. And I'll just repeat the first question again so you hear Robin. So the main question that we want to answer during this panel is, how have recent studies shed a new light on both mental illness and the function of psychedelics as treatment? What technologies and methods in particular have had a really big impact on the field? And Ruth just gave her answer, and I'm going to open it up to the rest of you to sort of jump in.
Well, I can jump in briefly, and
Sure,
I think for someone that comes sort of from my path, and I was just speaking to another senior colleague who was talking about the shift in clinical work, and when you first start practicing medicine, you look at the evidence and the books and the structured cognitive behavioral therapy, and you're really committed to this evidence-based thing. As you get a little bit more older, you get a little bit more responsible for helping run a health system like I have, you start to notice where the evidence-based treatments end. You start to notice who it doesn't help, and you try to figure out, why isn't it working in this person? And if we're lucky in PTSD, the conventional treatments, medication, and psychotherapy, if we're lucky, it helps 50-60% of people. There's a huge number of dropouts. It's extremely difficult. So I've been searching sort of the last decade for sort of what else can we offer people? What can we offer people when the evidence-based treatment doesn't work? And that's why scouring and looking for the evidence and looking for the research that is really compelling. It's really, really hard to ignore the quality research that's being done in this space, whether it's psilocybin, whether it's MDMA. And so I just think for me, it's let's try to find something else that we can offer people that can help them. Maybe to start off with, when the conventional treatments don't work, but in time, these may actually be preferred treatments. And that's kind of my hope. And that's what's brought me here.
Yeah, I think one of the most exciting things in this area, and really it links together the expertise of Ruth and Robin, significantly, is this idea that we're seeing, new techniques like neuroimaging really shining a light on the mechanisms that are underlying some of this, the possible reset or this, potential, greater utility of therapy that Ruth was so nicely describing. If we can understand that mechanism, we can really apply this across therapy. And to me as a scientist, that's really exciting, because it's really the new understanding, shedding a new light on how do we use this for best practices and helping patients ultimately.
Let's dive a little into the topic of, Rakesh, you mentioned that, a lot of these approved treatments for mental health, they're only effective on around half of patients. I guess a big question in many people's minds is, why is it that for decades there has been a sort of a halt on these new developments around mental health medications and treatments? Anyone who wants to jump in?
Well, I mean, I can start as somebody that's just in a process of transitioning from government. I think that, the psychedelics, I mean, we had this with cannabis as well. I mean, the problem always ends up being is when something has licit and illicit uses for recreational and for medicinal uses, the line gets blurred, it gets caught in. The first interview, just as I was sort of coming into this new position, I was researching the first interview that I did on sort of MDMA assisted psychotherapy was in about 2010. And I remember I got my wrist slapped a little bit for sort of, talking about this. And the way I spoke about it, I literally said in my quote, I said, if randomized control studies are done, and if there's evidence that shows this is safe and effective, and if Health Canada approves it, and if international societies sort of bless it, then we might consider it, right? But even that was a controversial statement in 2010. So I just think, I think that we get mixed up with, the words licit and illicit in the sense that, there could be an illicit use of Gravol. I mean, if you give it to high school kids to get a buzz from the anticholinergic effect, and there's illicit uses of cocaine if you're using it to freeze the eye or freeze the nose in surgery. So I think that we need to break away from some of that dichotomy, and what we're really trying to demonstrate here is the safety and efficacy of these substances. Think about, we've just gone through the vaccine trials. So in the same kind of sense, we're looking for things that work. We're looking for things that are safe. This is now being done in major university centers with ethic boards. And so we're really very, very strictly trying to do this. And part of it is to sort of, in some ways, it's the right way to do things, but it's also to convince the regulatory bodies that this is not sort of shady stuff around the corner. This is completely above board, and I think that's going to be the only way to have a lasting effect.
Yeah, I really agree, Rakesh, and I think that's why it's so important to do these studies in a very meticulous way, right, in a very scientific way, and to follow people, as long as we can, to also see the long-term effects, and so we can really examine, what are the long-term effects, both positive, and ask the questions, are there any negative effects? I think people will want to know that. And also really tracking, what happens both neurobiologically, but also on a bodily level. We know that trauma has a big effect on the inflammatory markers, for example. And so I think people will really be curious to see, can we change mind, brain, and body with these treatments? And how can we change them, and how long does it last?
Yeah, I think Ruth is touching on one of the most interesting aspects of this category of research is the fact that the compounds of interest, psilocybin in this case, and other psychedelics, really are they address multiple systems. We think of them as primarily addressing the central nervous system and their sort of prime effect, but they are very much active in the GI system, the immune system, in inflammation response. So it's really kind of an interesting open question in this area of research as to how that then branches into other conditions or helps more in nuanced ways address the prime conditions of interest like PTSD, depression, etc.
Yeah, and I think it's so important. We can't see any system in isolation, right? Because they're all connected, right? So I think it's really important to take a holistic approach here and really, also embrace the complexity of the human mind and brain and body.
It looks like we lost Robin again, but why don't we just move on and then he can hop in whenever his internet, cooperates.
Yes.
Internet problems. Why don't we dive a little bit more into the technology of brain imaging and fMRI? Could one of you explain, first of all, what fMRI is for those in our audience who may not be familiar, and how its developments over the past few years have affected the field of psychedelics?
All yours, Ruth.
All right. So fMRI stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging, and in short, it tracks what brain areas are active at any given time by looking at how oxygenated a certain area of the brain is. And usually when a certain area of the brain gets more active, for example, if we speak, we use Broca's area, it's sort of an area right here, and more blood flow goes to that area. And so that's what we track with functional MRI. So what brain areas are active? And we can look at it in two ways. For example, we can look at what areas become active, but that's only part of the story because we know that the brain functions as networks. So brain areas fire together. And what we see in psychopathology, so in depression, in post-traumatic stress, is that brain activation of certain brain regions is altered, especially brain regions involved in emotional reactivity, such as the amygdala or the periaqueductal gray, which are areas that process emotion, and then areas that regulate those emotions. So higher brain areas, for example, in the cortex, that can sort of modulate that emotional reactivity. So that's what we see in terms of brain activation, so specific areas that are activated. But the field has really moved to looking at more of the complex picture of how the brain functions, which is in networks. And so we have different networks that are critical to our cognitive functioning. We have, a network that helps us to think and, plan. It's called the executive network, for example. We have the salience network that helps us to figure out what's most salient in the environment, or both externally and internally, so we can guide our behaviors. And then we have the default mode network, and Robin has studied this in response to psilocybin, which is a network that really underlies who we are in this world, our sense of self in this world, and really self-relevant processing, also memory processing. And these are things that have really been shown to be affected, of course, by psilocybin. So the integrity of the default mode network that underlies who we are in this world, we have seen through Robin's studies shift in people with depression. And also the way we recall memories that are also critical to the default network can change, in people after psilocybin use. And Robin has actually done some of these studies, so I think he'd be in a great position to comment further.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm so sorry about this. It's been frustrating the last couple of days, and it's a recent issue. But yes, as Ruth says, analyses are now becoming more about networks rather than distinct modules in the brain serving distinct functions, but rather distributed networks of regions. And they're also becoming more dynamic. So rather than looking at the properties of brain regions or systems on average across a chunk of time, we can look more dynamically at trajectories of brain activity across time. And those analyses are yielding new insights generally in cognitive neuroscience, and new insights about the brain action of psychedelics as well. And a particular finding that is emerging from our more recent analyses is that under the influence of psychedelics, certain hierarchically high-level brain networks, and these are networks of regions that host the most important target of psychedelic drugs, a particular subtype, particular serotonin receptor subtype. These networks appear to break down, and novel patterns of functional connectivity appear to replace them, more globally interconnected patterns of brain activity and brain communication. So it's almost as if these distinct high-level networks, some of those that Ruth was referring to, the default mode network involved in internal mentation and imagination, and executive networks and attention networks, closely related, appear to break down, their boundaries appear to break down. Those patterns are sort of skipped over, in a sense, under the psychedelic, and the brain appears to inhabit a more globally diffuse pattern of brain communication under the psychedelics.
And if I can jump in as somebody that sort of has to translate this beautiful science sometimes for patients, my oldest daughter is studying first year psychology, and I see they're teaching things a little bit wrong because they haven't kept up with the great stuff that Rob and Ruth are saying. And what they teach quite often is this spot in the brain is where fear is. This spot in the brain is where memory is, right? The amygdala runs amok in PTSD. And really what we've learned over the years, and I remember, some of the first subjects we used to measure parts of the brain, is really the part of the brain that reminds the scared part, hey, it's okay, you're not in Afghanistan anymore. This isn't happening again. They're offline, they're not talking to each other, right? So the idea of treatment is to get the parts of the brain to start talking to each other again. And the really exciting thing, and I think one of the things that we haven't said as explicitly, all of the psychedelics that we're talking about, we're not really talking about giving somebody a medication the same way you're giving somebody an antidepressant. We're talking about psychotherapy associated with that. So what we're thinking, hypothesizing, and hope to prove is that we're opening up channels, opening up networks, altering networks that make people more receptive to the ideas in therapy. Ruth talked about moral injury, the guilt and the shame and anger that sometimes veterans feel after deployments and after a career. So for many, many years, people have been saying, let's talk about that. Let's reflect on how you feel about your colleagues dying and things like that. But they're so defended, they're not receptive to it. So we're hoping that with the psilocybin experience, some upregulation, downregulation, some connections are going to change, that some of these therapeutic techniques and talking to them, they're going to be more receptive to it. So that's part of what excites us as well. So, just like we never delink safety and efficacy, we want things that work and are safe. I think the other thing that we're not delinking is the medication-assisted psychotherapy. We're really talking about changing the brain to be more receptive to psychotherapies, and changing the medication. The dose is one thing, the timing, but also the type of psychotherapy is something that we're going to be studying in our trials.
Yeah, related to what Rakesh is saying, I always like to think about this, what's the potential a few steps down the road? And so really using imaging techniques as well as also new, overlaps of looking at known biomarkers related to these conditions, overlapping with these imaging techniques. If you think about how that can then be extrapolated down the line, it really allows us to better understand, and not only understand, but define this period of receptiveness to therapy. And so really it's ultimately a better understanding that'll enable more patients to get access to this treatment, because it'll better describe when is that receptive period appropriate for therapy, what's the time period, how do you actually use precise dosing to do that most efficiently and with the least amount of safety risk or side effects to the patient. So really this is the building blocks of how this matures into a very precisely prescribable adjunct or aid to therapy, which is really exciting to me.
That's a really good point, Robert. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions I hear in the world of psychedelics, the people who are just, poking their noses in because they're curious, is that, people are very heavily focused on the fact that companies are developing these drugs for treatment. And there doesn't seem to be as big of a focus on the psychotherapy part of this, at least from the newcomers peeking in. Ruth, I would love to hear a little bit about what that process actually looks like. This idea of taking these treatments and then having them be more receptive to psychotherapy. What does that process actually look like in a setting?
Yeah, and I think that's a critical question, and that's also a critical component of this treatment, right? That I think we really have to underline. And I think, there's different phases of it, right? There's the preparation phase that, in my opinion, needs to look as closely to the psychedelic as possible. So things are very predictable for the client. When they have these hallucinatory experiences, these, when they enter this different world, that, they've been grounded in the first session, pre-psychedelic, and that gives them a foundation and really a holding environment to have this experience. And then I think during the psychedelic experience, the therapist, again, provides a container, a holding environment, and really, provides the safety for the patient to be able to form new connections, to reflect, to experience new things. And for example, one of my patients experienced for the first time during a psychedelic experience was the capacity to experience positive emotion. They had never been able to do that before because they felt very non-deserving of experiencing anything positive. And so just being the holding environment, being the container while individuals go through these events, and sometimes they can be unpleasant also. And so I think sometimes we have to provide a reality check. For example, if somebody starts believing that a close relative has died, that has not died, I think the responsibility of the therapist is just to gently say, actually, I don't believe, your relative is dead. And again, foster that safety through that hold. And then I think there's also a real place to start thinking about the follow-up care. How can we approach the follow-up care now that the individual's sense of self has really shifted? They've experienced new things, new avenues have opened up for them. And how do we continue to process that with an individual, right? To really foster a new sense of being in this world, which I think is something we really want to achieve through good treatment. So I think there's different phases that are all critical, that we all need to study, and that are all very interesting and very exciting.
And that's, to complement, absolutely, Ruth, that's beautifully put. I think that, the team that we've put together as our primary investigators and also our advisory board, are clinician scientists for the large part, people that have sat in the room 3 feet across from people that are suffering with PTSD. And I think that we are considering the psychotherapy to be an active ingredient here. This is part of what we're studying. There's all kinds of different approaches: cognitive behavioral, exposure therapies, acceptance and commitment therapies, self-psychology. There's all kinds of different ones. And we're considering that one of the variables. And that's why we've deliberately chosen to do multiple sites, small phase 2A kind of trials, because we consider the medication. And then as we go to larger trials, our investigators, we're having our first call tomorrow. We're all going to sit together and sort of share notes and ideas, because I think there's the safety piece, and Ruth is right, the preparatory phase. You don't want to scare people. Sometimes the psychedelic experience can be a bit harsh. So to some ways you want to facilitate, you want to guide, but you don't want to get in the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the dance of what we're trying to do here. And I think trauma is a little different than depression. Not better, worse, but it's different. And I think as Ruth knows, we can slice and dice trauma in so many different ways. There's a lot of difference between the horrific childhood abuse that some of our patients have and the wartime experiences as adults. So in terms of how we do the therapy, like, we're really in learning mode, to be honest with you. We've got a group of experts around us, but we're in learning mode, and we cannot understate the importance of the psychotherapy. And we have more questions than answers, and that's full disclosure.
Yeah, I really agree with you, not getting in the way, Rakesh. And one analogy I often use with my patients is, letting the butterfly emerge. I always say, don't mess with the larva. Yeah. Just let the butterfly emerge. And, I stand back and I coach them to really get in touch with their own strengths, their own inner resilience. And I think that's really what we need to do here as well, and just keep providing that container of safety and reassurance when required.
That aspect of allowing inner growth and sort of this inner discovery is interesting, because it really draws a strong correlation, a strong connection to the traditional use of a lot of these substances. And something as a scientist I think is really, really interesting is that we're really kind of looking at this in a new context and a new lens, but maybe some of the underlying functionality of the individuals is actually quite similar to what might have been done in more traditional practice, just with a completely different setting, et cetera. And so that's, I think, really, really interesting, and understanding the overlap of kind of how is that aspect best used in medicine, because it's so different than current regimes of treatment. So that's I think one of our biggest open questions, like Rakesh was saying. There's a lot of open questions. I think this is one of the biggest ones, but it's a very interesting one. I think one that'll see really strong benefit as we continue to understand it better.
Now, Ruth, I know some of your research has touched on the topic of moral injury, which has also come up a few times already in this panel, and it's a huge concept to mental health. Could you explain to our audience what exactly moral injury is and the potential of psychedelic therapies on moral injury, especially as it relates to our current pandemic?
Absolutely. That's a big topic. And I'll give you a quote from one of the veterans I talked to years ago that I think really defines what moral injury is. And this veteran told me years ago, Ruth, I cannot look anyone in the eyes for fear that they will see the stain on my soul for what I did. And I think that's really the essence of moral injury, having done something or not done something or witnessed something that goes against your moral standards. So one example, from a military member would be if they saw a child being killed in battle and they weren't able to help the child. And they come back home and they're torn apart about this. They're imagining, what, the father thinks about this child now, and often they relate this to their own child. If they have a child, how would I feel if I had lost my child like this and I wasn't able to help? And so they're torn apart inside. And, they often say, I feel like this is eating me inside. It's this gut-wrenching, visceral feeling of, just badness and awfulness that literally eats people inside. And we know from Brett Litz's work and other work that this is also very much associated with suicide. And it's very difficult for individuals to talk about. And so when they have this moral injury and when they have this experience of shame, people often look down. They can't look anyone in the eye, right? Because if anybody was to look them in the eye, they would know what a bad person they are. And so not only is it incredibly distressing for the individual, but I think it also really affects their capacity to interact with others. And they become isolated, which of course further increases the risk for suicide. How does this relate to the COVID-19 pandemic? And I think this has been a topic that's been discussed very much in the COVID-19 pandemic, especially with regard to healthcare workers, right? And so there's moral distress around, if I get sick, will I give COVID to my elderly parents or to other family members who will then be significantly affected? Or, another moral distress is around, we know so little about this virus, right? There's not enough I can do for people. And moral distress and moral injury can also relate around feeling betrayed by an institution. So especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't have enough personal protective equipment, I think a lot of healthcare workers really felt like they're being thrown to the wolves, and that there's nothing there to protect them. And so those feelings of betrayal, I think, were also very high. So this is something that is very much associated with post-traumatic stress, with depression, with suicide, and it's something very important to be aware of and ask in an assessment. So when you're seeing a client, but it's also important to be aware of that this is not easy for people to talk about. And so often when you ask, do you feel guilt or shame, you don't get much. But, if you track somebody's gaze, and if they always show a downward gaze, and, you comment on that, sometimes just saying, I notice it's hard for you to make eye contact. What's it like to make eye contact? What makes that difficult? Sometimes that's an easier way to get at it. Or sometimes I just say, I just quote the veteran and I say, one of the guys just, told me that, I can't look anyone in the eye for fear that they will see the stain on my soul. Does that kind of stuff ever happen to you? And I think that really helps individuals to connect with this. And so, yeah, I think it's important to think about different ways of approaching this, but I think it's a critical area to be aware of.
Yeah, I think, Ruth, just to jump on, a couple of things. The healthcare professionals, and one of the things that we've discussed sort of within military circles is, we have often been sent into humanitarian crises, into war zones. So the concepts of triage, rationing medication, deciding who's going to get the treatment, who's not going to get the treatment is something that a very small number of health professionals are used to. But in the Western world, most physicians are not trained to kind of have to do this. So the actual moral walking in and wondering if you're going to have enough ICUs, wondering about things like that. I think that's the piece. The other thing I just wanted to say is that I think this is a good time also, and hopefully Robin will join us again, is just how we're getting away from this brain-mind duality, and how the imaging is actually saying, there are parts of the brain that represent this fear, represent this. And can you speak a little bit about the work right now? I mean, not to plug our own paper, but about how we kind of think we know where shame exists in the brain, or?
Sure. And we've just had a paper accepted. It's just in press, and it's in collaboration with Rakesh and my graduate student, Chantel Lloyd, who's just graduated, is the first author. And the first analysis we did was actually look at what specific areas of the brain activate during a shame response. And what we find is that there's one brain region called the insula. It's sort of, right at the intersection between the limbic system, the emotional system, and the cortex, the outer mantle of the brain that helps us to think. And it's the back part of that region that's involved in disgust, in moral disgust, and really carries those visceral sensations, so that experiencing that pit in the stomach, or that gut-wrenching pain. And that's the region that's really active when individuals recall memories of moral injury. And this may really be relating to the fact that they feel like they're, being eaten up inside. So this region very prominently activates. And the other thing that occurs is that higher regions in the cortex that can modulate these lower emotional regions that make us feel upset, that seems to become hyperactive in an attempt to kind of modulate all that distress. What's also interesting about, these feelings of being eaten up inside and that visceral distress is that we're not conscious of that completely. We're conscious that it's distressing, but we can't name it. It's not at a level that we can name it. So I think these individuals are confronted with an incredible amount of distress, bodily, visceral distress, that they can't name and that they can't put words to, which I think makes it even more difficult also to communicate and to process.
Which is the huge aspect of let's do pre and post imaging in all of these people and identify, sort of perhaps pathology ahead of time in the brain, and hopefully resolving it after the psychedelic experience in the psychotherapy.
Absolutely, yeah.
This really too speaks to the sea change that we were sort of talking about at the beginning, where we're, going from a paradigm where people are, having to self-describe something that's very uncomfortable and very difficult for them to self-describe. And if we can match that with a, non-self-described measure of some sort, it really does enhance the therapy that we can provide. And it continues to sort of, point that lens, like I was mentioning earlier, on how do we best pinpoint the patients that are going to see the best benefit. And from a, how do we get this to the most patients fastest point of view? Also, if we can use this sort of precise knowledge of brain imaging or of the, underlying mechanism of these conditions, and then show that psychedelic-assisted therapy is really changing that quickly. There's actually accelerating designations that you can get with groups like the FDA, especially if you're dealing with something that's a terminal risk, like suicide risk, and you can really get these accelerated. You can, they're still under regulatory review, but you can get them to a larger amount of patients in earlier stages. And so this is something that I think is really a strong aspect of this research, is that it may really stand as the foundation for moving those things forward on a regulatory side, which will be, massively expand the patients that can be addressed, not just within the scope of a clinical trial, but across, larger practice.
Piggybacking on what you just said, Robert, about how this can help us get really specific treatments for very specific patients. Ruth, I think maybe this question would be best directed at you. Like, how does moral injury specifically differ from PTSD in terms of how it's defined, first of all, but also in terms of how it can be treated or could be treated?
Yeah, and that's the million-dollar question. So how does it differ from PTSD? The most recent criteria in the diagnostic manual, the 5th version, actually includes guilt and shame. but it doesn't address specifically moral injury. And so Rakesh and I have actually been talking about how can we make this more prominent in, the classification of post-traumatic stress. We've been discussing, does it need to be a separate subtype, or, how do we go about classifying this in more detail? So I think that's still an open question. And in terms of treatment, these recent results that we got really made me think about, how we need to think about treatment in really two ways. There's top-down approaches, right, which cognitive behavioral therapy is a great example of. So that really, we work with our thinking brain, with the narrative, with language, and we really modulate the brain top-down, right? So the brain can regulate from a top-down way these emotional responses. But if this top part of the brain is not fully functioning, as it seems to be in moral injury, then we also need to think about bottom-up mechanisms, right? So how can we intervene at a bottom-up level? And some of these treatments are bodily-based treatments, yoga, exercise. I think psychedelics also have the ability to intervene at a bottom-up level and kind of reset the brain from that kind of level. Neurofeedback is another way that can, I think, intervene from a bottom-up level. And so how can we really shift this emotion from being just a visceral sensation to an emotion that somebody can think about and that somebody can process at a higher level? Because in order to shift things eventually, you have to rethink the experience, right? And kind of really reset the experience and think about, maybe this wasn't my fault, right? I did the best that I could. This was my job. I had to do this to protect my comrades. But in order to be able to process at that level, you have to be able to label the emotion. It has to be at a conscious level, and all those higher level structures need to be online. And so I think that's how we need to think about this type of treatment.
I think just to echo that, beautifully put, Ruth. I think we've talked about let's get rid of the mind-brain duality, but let's also get rid of the brain-body duality.
Yes.
Right? Let's get rid of that, because the idea is to think for a moment that diseases of the mind, diseases of the brain don't affect the body. And we've talked about inflammation. We've talked about all of these things. When you look at veterans of war, whether it's World War I, World War II, and the most recent conflicts, they tend to have a higher rate of physical illnesses, whether it's diabetes, heart disease, chronic pain. So there is something going on in the body. There's something going on in the neuroendocrine system, the immune system, whether it's inflammation, whether it's all of these things. And we're seeing sort of the inflammation of the blood vessels of the heart cause an increase in heart disease. So the idea of, again, if mental illness can affect the body, maybe working at the body can also affect the mind, right? So the idea of this duality, the coexistence of them as opposed to a this or that, I think is really important. Again, the reason why we are committed to this battery of biomarkers as well. We are looking to see not just how the brain structure and function changes with the psychedelic and the psychotherapy, but we're also looking to see how the immune system responds, how the inflammatory system responds, because when you see psychedelics being sort of pitched, for lack of a better word, for all of these treatments, from addictions to pain to depression or PTSD, it's either snake oil or there is something underlying, a common mechanism, which is, again, what we're committed to looking for as well and adding to the literature. So we'll do a battery of tests, whether it's blood, imaging, pre and post, to kind of see, do we settle down the inflammation in the body through the psychedelic treatment and psychotherapy. So I think that's the important piece as well. So we'll get away from the duality of brain and mind, but we'll also get away from the duality of brain, mind, and body, and realize that there's a whole human there, and that's what we're going to try to work on. I don't want to use the cliche of holistic, but in some sense that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, the past methodologies of binning these different systems as if they don't interact and don't, talk to each other is really just sort of, antiquated at this point. And when you think about just the basic facts of what we're doing on a, cellular level or on a drug design level, we're taking a psychedelic substance which binds to serotonin receptors, and we know that there's serotonin receptors in all sorts of different organ systems throughout the body, not just the central nervous system. So you'd expect these sort of whole body effects and aspects to the treatment. So it's best to understand that. And the other side of that too, where Rakesh was mentioning these biomarkers that we have interest in, this isn't quite as visually profound and interesting as some of the fMRI work, where you can see very sort of visual representations of the data. But the molecular biology side of this has also seen massive increases in the technology and the ability to look at these sorts of metrics in more and more depth. And so the two of them are really moving forward nicely and allowing us to shine a better light on what's actually happening mechanistically. That really can't be understated, that the underlying science has significantly gotten better while this has all happened, and the increasing interest in the field has happened, and all of them are working together. The current situation wouldn't have materialized without one of those aspects.
Robin, can you hear us okay?
I can, yes. Yeah, good. Well, I can't hear everybody. I hear, it's patchy, the audio. I'm so sorry, but I can hear you now. So
perfect. Robin, I just have one question directed towards you before I sort of get on to our last question. I know it's almost time to wrap up. But Robin, you recently published a paper detailing a new construct, pivotal mental states. Could you describe for our audience what exactly that is and how it sort of relates to the larger question of psychedelic treatments?
Yes, sure. I suppose that in a sense it evolved from trying to understand what natural system psychedelics as sort of unnatural, in a sense, perturbations are working on. Why does that system exist? Under what conditions does it upregulate or become engaged outside of the context of psychedelics? So in a sense, the ideas and the data that fostered the ideas were sort of related to psychedelics, but about sort of contextualizing what psychedelics do. And so for me, this notion of, and it could have been called a number of things, but pivotal mental states is referring to a few key criteria. One, that these states are hyperplastic. And so within these states, there is an exceptional ability for the mind and the brain and behavior to be changed in relation to the conditions that those systems are in during that period. And also that those changes can be particularly marked or dramatic. And so notions like psychological transformation that have been written about very, beautifully in the literature, in psychology literature, I'm trying to frame in a more neurobiological way, as Rakesh was saying, trying to address different ways of looking at the same phenomenon, whether it's psychological, neurobiological, but trying to do it within the same piece. And what I discovered while researching around this was that stress is a particularly reliable or particularly reliable conditions in which these pivotal mental states, defined by hyperplasticity, sensitivity to context, and upregulation of the serotonin 2A receptor system. Stress is a reliable, natural, if you want, way of inducing these states. And that makes sense to me in terms of the phenomenology around, transformative psychological experiences. They're often preceded by crisis, intense stress, prolonged stress. And so for me, working these things out, and it's a hypothesis, it's there to be tested, help me understand why we might have, this this system in our brains and bodies that can be engaged under particularly challenging conditions, where a period of intense plasticity might help us, because really maybe our lives literally depend on our ability to be exceptionally adaptive, because whatever strategies, cognitive, behavioral, aren't working, and maybe our life is in danger in some way, and something needs to give, something needs to change. And so for me, it's sort of understanding, outside of the context of psychedelics, what can happen in the brain that can induce, what changes, what processes can play out that induce something akin to a psychedelic-like experience that seem to engage the same pharmacological and other neurobiological mechanisms that psychedelics kind of hack or hijack.
Thanks for that, Robin. And just for the sake of time, we only have 5 minutes left before we move on to the Q&A portion of this panel. But I wanted to pose this question to all of you. We've seen this hugely increased interest into psychedelics over the past few years, and especially over the past few months. This is a two-part question. The first part is, I wanted to ask you guys all why you think this interest is here now, the timing of it, the degree of it, why you think that's happening. And then second of all, how you think that this interest will impact the realm of psychedelic science moving forward. For example, what can we expect to see in 5 years' time as a result of this renewed interest in the field? Ruth, why don't we start with you, and then we can sort of work counterclockwise through the rest of the panelists.
Sure. I think what we're seeing is that we're starting to have a critical mass of people interested in this and studying it. I think it's being studied at some of the mainstream places. Robin is one example here. And I think you need a critical mass to get to a certain point of interest. And I think that's where we're at. And what I also see is that, especially with the younger generation, is that people feel really stuck with the current treatments that we have. As Rakesh talked about, we've got some great treatments. However, a lot of people don't progress and a lot of people drop out. And so I think people are feeling stuck, they're feeling frustrated, and I think they're ready to explore something new. And so those are, I think, two important factors that have brought us to where we are right now.
How do you see this impacting the field of psychedelics moving forward?
I think we're going to have, a massive amount of data in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think it's really going to inform treatment and policy. That's where I see it's going.
Thanks, Ruth. Robert, why don't we move on to you? What are your thoughts on this?
Excellent. Thank you. So I think I agree completely with Ruth that the sort of critical mass is a large aspect of it. I think there's probably been a couple publications. Certainly the work out of ICL, like Robin, has been highly reported in the popular press. I think that's one aspect. Also, Michael Pollan's work, I think, in his recent book, I think that was a large step in the right direction. But I think also, too, that couldn't have necessarily happened without the increase in the quality of the data that's been associated with it. There's been, hints, really strong hints and strong pieces of data out of, sort of a piecemeal of research over the last 50 years. And because the quality of the data has really caught up with it, I think it's becoming much harder to argue against. And that aspect, that balance is really what I see as shifting. And I think, if I move forward 5 years in my own mind, I think really what understanding this more precisely is going to do is allow a sequential enabling of different conditions that we can use to treat with psychedelics, primarily like we're talking about here, assisting psychotherapy, but as was mentioned, there's, applicability across a number of different body systems, and I see those as new frontiers in this area, things along the lines of the immune system, inflammation, et cetera, like Rakesh was mentioning.
Thanks, Rob. Robin, how about you?
Well, for a long time, it's been hard in a sense for this area to be taken seriously. So I've got to be honest, I'm very much enjoying the present mainstreaming of things, seeing papers get into prestigious journals, and seeing a lot of luminaries in academic psychiatry, like those that you have on the call here, becoming interested now is wonderful to see. Yes, it's kind of affirming in a way. I remember the days of speaking to people at conferences where they would kind of literally scoff, the triviality of studying how psychedelic drugs work in the brain. So this is great, and of course it translates into more resources to do research, to ask more questions, and indeed build that critical mass of evidence. And it is so rich. I mean, there's a lot to all of this, to be processed, nuances in relationships, new ways of thinking about mental health itself, as well as interventions for mental health. So I do believe it's very healthy. And having recently done a trial where we've gone head to head with a conventional treatment for depression, that's helped contextualize for me quite how different psychedelic therapy is to a standard antidepressant medication, for example.
And Rakesh, last but not least.
Yeah, I could echo everything that everybody said. I think to change sort of a slightly different line, I think that for those of us that have been around long enough, we've sort of grown up in the SSRI, starting with Prozac kind of era, right? So what happens is it's now been about 30 years. So it's time for change. That's kind of the natural history, the cycle. We had antipsychotics, tricyclics before that. So I think that's one of the pieces. I also think in the perfect storm kind of sense, we're talking a lot about academia and the scientists. I think we've also given our patients a voice. Right? We've increased awareness of mental illness. It's come out of the shadows. So guess what? At a point, it's no longer stigmatizing. You can talk about it. But now it's beyond talk about it. They're actually now demanding. They're sort of saying what you're giving us isn't good enough. So I think those things are happening. I think in terms of the science, okay, we've sliced and diced and tried to do what we can with these SSRIs, NRIs. Let's look beyond. Let's look for something else biological. Our patients are sort of saying, guess what? Everything you've done for me doesn't quite make me as good. I mean, Ruth's point of feeling joy again. Antidepressants don't actually make people happy. They hopefully make them less depressed, right? So that's the piece. And the last thing I want to say is that let's not pat ourselves on the back too much, because you go back 100 years, 120 years, many years, people were using substances like this, and in fact doing medication-assisted psychotherapy with some success. Back with Freud and Genet and Bastian's with LSD, post with the Holocaust survivors in Leiden University. So we are sort of, it's a renaissance, but it really, like most, you're sort of rediscovering something that people knew. And from a psychological perspective, of course, you have inhibition, you have things that block you from accessing things. And sometimes the therapist sits there and says, geez, if only I could remove that thick blanket you have and get at the real meat. And I think people knew that years and years ago. So I think we're at this juncture in history where the science kind of meets our patients where they are. And so we've maybe become a bit more liberal in the sense that we're sort of being open-minded in terms of researching things. So I think we've just hit that point with academia, with culture, and certainly I think the giving our patients a voice has played a big role in this.
Thanks, guys. Let's move on to the Q&A portion of this panel. We have a lot of questions that have come in. Let's see. Well, one of the questions here says, how should we expect the rollout of psychedelic treatments like what should we expect it to look like? For example, will it be in clinics? Will it be in a hospital setting? In any scenario, would it be a take-home prescription medication? I'll leave that open to any of you to answer.
I can kick off. I think everybody's got their thoughts about it. I think that one of the things that we've touched upon is the medication and the psychotherapy, right? So I think both are there. I think for now, we are going to do our sort of hospital-based just to be safe, just as we learn sort of in terms of how people can react, what a bad trip looks like, good trip looks like, and then sort of psychotherapy after that. I do see it heading into outpatients. I do see it happening that way. And Rob can speak a little bit to sort of, part of what we're going to, of course, try to figure out is, let's modify the molecules so they don't have to last 5-6 hours. Let's find alternate ways of delivering it. Let's sort of see if we can modify things to have less side effects, have them more tolerable. Can we get the psychedelic? Can we get the benefits of it without the so-called experience that can be sometimes negative? But I think we're going to have institutions that are going to train people in doing these therapies, because the therapies are important. I think it's going to take a while for the universities to catch up and start putting it into the regular sort of PhD psychology and master social work programs. But I do see it rolling out, and I'd love to see a point eventually where we understand the molecules so well that somebody could take one a half an hour before their psychotherapy session in the waiting room, have their therapy session, and then be able to safely go home a half hour afterwards, maybe with the drive or maybe themselves. I think, but we're going to have to modify the biology of the molecule before that. And I know Rob has a lot of thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, to build on what Rakesh is saying, I think that really is the theme, is that we're seeing really strong data and results coming out around what I view as, the natural product, or sort of the version 1 of the active in this therapy. And exactly like he's highlighted, there's really strong things that can be done in the formulation, in the exact delivery of the molecule, and its co-formulation to seriously address some of the known, incompatibilities or known side effects. Certainly, the current, group of actives that people have been looking at around psilocybin and LSD are very long-acting, as well as there's a significant potential for anxiety. These are things that we're looking at as targets for our research, where there's definitely known ways that we can reduce the risk of those happening. And this is a major theme around regulatory approval of drugs, is understanding the side effect profile and then reducing it. And you see this, highlighted in completely other areas of drug development, where the iterative improvements have been largely around safety profile, et cetera. And so I think that's something that will be addressing those issues in a pointed fashion, will both increase the access to patients across more indications, which is kind of a constant theme, but we'll also address a lot of the regulatory issues and regulatory concerns, which I think are going to be a major gating issue to this becoming more widely available. And so I think, to just sort of finally, address the pointed part of that question, I do think this will kind of go in a nested fashion of being an inpatient therapy to then an outpatient therapy, over a large fraction of the day. And then as the additional safety aspects and, understanding of the mechanism are understood, possibly outpatient. But there's a lot of questions that need to be answered before that's a safe choice at this point from a regulatory and, medical treatment point of view.
All right, I am just going to tackle these questions based on which one's got the most votes. So the number 1 on our list is from an addiction medicine doctor in Toronto, and it's directed towards Robin, but I think any one of our panelists can answer it. Can you comment on molecular derivatives that lack the psychedelic experience, for example, 18-MC? Can we expect good results in the absence of a mystical experience? Robin, why don't we start with you, and then anyone else can jump in.
Sure. So the audio has just kicked in, so I think I've got it. And yes, we saw that fascinating paper from David Olson and his colleagues on this apparent non-psychedelic ibogaine derivative that seemed to have an antidepressant readout in an animal model of depression. Yeah, fascinating. I've got to say, I'm a bit of a skeptic about whether it will translate into humans. We'll see. I think, makes sense. It'd be useful if I'm wrong here, because it would be a nice thing and convenient if you can induce a desirable plasticity and changes in mind and mood states without the fireworks of a psychedelic experience that sometimes can be very difficult to tolerate, can be quite unpleasant. I just doubt that it's going to translate, and I sense that the experience itself is part of the transformation itself, that there are learnings that occur, a fancy term, but an epistemic transformation, that through the experience you now know something, you can look at things differently, you can look at yourself differently, your past, how you fell into depression or whatever your symptoms are. And that's important. The experience is important. It's like, a journey where you're conscious for that journey, or you were knocked out, at the end of the journey. If you were knocked out for it, are you going to have learned the same lessons as if you were sort of, mopping it all up and learning along the way? So I just wonder, and, there is a history of animal models and trials in animals where there has been failure of those initial promising findings to try.
I think you're cutting out again, Robin.
Oh no.
I think I mean to sort of add to that, I think that's the beauty of the science, and I do. That's a question, and some different organizations have been funding similar research to that, and in the traditional sense, what we've done in medicine quite often is we've done what are called dismantling studies, right? You sort of try to break apart a treatment into parts, and I think one of the best examples that I mean Ruth can sort of comment on as well is the EMDR, right? Eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which was the breakthrough therapy with eye movements. And there was a beautiful example of, I mean, it's an effective therapy, tons of studies. There was a beautiful neurological example of how the actual brain, the eye movements from side to side work. But when they dismantled the study, they did, with or without eye movements, they found out that you could still get the effective treatment without the eye movements happening. So I think that, Robin, I was just saying while you cut out that this is the beauty of doing dismantling studies, right? If we're able to sort of separate and see, then we'll see what aspects contribute, and we'll look at, you can almost power a study to see, what aspects are essential and what aspects are, and I think that's the scientist in me is curious to sort of see, how important is the psychotherapy, how important is the timing, how important is the dose, how important is the psychedelic experience. So I think that's part of the learning that I think that will go, because again, safety and efficacy, if it's necessary, we'll give it. If it's not necessary, we won't. I think that's as we move forward.
Absolutely, yes. Let's let the data speak, I suppose. But yeah. My hunch is
I'm with you. No, I absolutely. I didn't disagree with you. I added to your comments. No, I think my gut is the same thing. I think that is the essential part of the awakening that occurs in the person. But I am sort of curious to sort of explore that.
Absolutely.
To echo Robin's sentiment too, from a different point of view, there are many examples where redesigning a molecule to then be more selective on the receptors that it's hitting, because that's really what they're doing, is making it more specific to a different subset of serotonin receptors than the classical psychedelics. There are numerous examples in the drug development, sort of history, where that does not extrapolate through to as you move into early stage clinicals or later stage clinicals where there may be unknown side effects. And so I think that's one of the big benefits that psilocybin has that's a little bit maybe less understood or less given credit to. But the fact that this has been used for centuries by humans and has been used consistently really suggests a undercurrent of safety and efficacy in its prior use. And so really kind of, pointing a medical, study lens at how is that best utilized, there's a much stronger likelihood of success than just a random synthetic molecule out of a chemistry set. There's a big aspect of translating as it scales up, that at each of those scale stages, a new novel molecule has a high likelihood of failure for a whole number of complex reasons. I think that's that also from a very different point of view speaks to what Robin was saying, that it's very interesting, but there's a strong likelihood it won't extrapolate all the way through.
All right. This question is asking about Mydecine's perspective on naturally occurring psilocybin versus synthetic psilocybin, keeping in mind bioactive ingredients and the entourage effect. I am just going to throw that out to the entire panel. Whoever wants to catch it, go ahead.
So I'm happy to jump in there. My past commercial work was in a different system in cannabis, where the entourage effect really does control a large amount of the effect, and is being shown more and more on a sequential basis that that's true. So this is a system where I see all of the same building blocks suggesting that there is an entourage effect. So if you look at the thin amount of literature on the chemistry that's actually produced in these mushrooms, and there's actually over 200 species of psilocybin producing mushrooms. It's not just a single species, so there's quite a diversity there. There's known instances of production of numerous tryptamines, so the category of active compounds that psilocybin and psilocin are in, and they are known to have slightly different pharmacological properties. In other contexts, when you mix multiple actives that are all slightly different, the combinations are highly relevant to their actual effects. Additionally, there's also evidence that the psychedelic mushrooms are producing small amounts of a compound that actually makes you more sensitive to the prime psychedelic, the psilocybin. And so knowing that between 5 different species of psilocybin mushrooms, you would have different amounts of those. To me, there's absolutely nuance in the effect. Whether that's an entourage effect that can be medically utilized, I think is a big question. I think there's definitely difference in the effect, but whether that will translate into, say, reduced anxiety potential is a very sort of interesting and valuable question that we're looking at answering. That's kind of I think the basis of where the entourage effect sits in there. And happy to have others jump in, but that's kind of our prime interest as a company, is that basic foundation of knowledge.
All right, next question. How many experiences do you suggest a therapist have to make them totally familiar with the altered states? This is an interesting one. Ruth, why don't you start and then we can sort of go around.
That's a great question. And the short answer is I don't know. I would imagine, probably several to really become familiar with that. And I'd be curious to hear other people's opinions.
I think it's interesting. In the two opposite extremes, the traditional use of a lot of these substances is with the practitioner, the shaman in that case. If you're talking about hundreds of years ago, traditional use is to take the substance with the patient or with the person that they're intending on helping, which is starkly different than the way that the current clinical trials have been set up, where the investigator may or may not have prior personal experience, but they're certainly not taking the substance at the same exact time. And so I think the mature solution there is going to likely include best practices that are informed from both sides of that equation, from the personal understanding as well as the therapy-centric medical utility.
Robin, do you want to jump in?
Okay, sure. I'm sorry. It's for whatever reason it's Rob. I can't hear particularly, but I think the ideal of a number of experiences is an ideal, and it's going to be challenging to deliver on that ideal. When this intervention achieves licensing, as I think it will, we're going to have an interesting bottleneck in terms of supply to demand. I mean, we already have that. People wanting to get into research studies, but maybe it will be even more sort of intensified when there's more widespread potential access. And so I think mentorship is going to play a major role. That's already part of training programs that I've seen, where although not everyone who's serving as a therapist for psychedelic sessions might have a lot of personal experience, there will be at least one person supervising a team on site who can provide mentorship for those particularly challenging, maybe somewhat anomalous, difficult experiences that can happen, where based on personal experience they can come in and share their experience in a way that helps those who are less experienced to know how to navigate a challenging session.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm agreeing with everything everybody says. I don't think, I think I don't know, that was the first answer out of Ruth, was probably the most honest one. I think to follow on Robin, I mean, it's about training, right? It's about training and supervision. And what's going to happen is that as this grows, we're going to find a real gap of therapists. We're going to find lots of doctors that might be comfortable prescribing 25 milligrams of psilocybin, once a week or something. But do we have trained people when we set up the training centers? It's a very personal thing to ask somebody to take something to be, they have to make that choice, and that has to be an informed choice. And I'd hate to lose very good therapists if people say, I'd rather not do it. So I think, to Robin's point, people that are aware, people that are experienced, I think that's crucial. In psychiatry, we have a tradition really that's left to the psychoanalysts. I mean, if you're going to do psychoanalytic training, they expect you to go through psychoanalysis. We don't necessarily have that for a lot of the other therapies. But it certainly is an excellent question, and I think that the training centers that'll pop up, they're going to pop up across the way, and we've been talking about setting some up for ourselves. That will certainly be one of the things that we'd have to consider. I think a therapist that has no other contraindications, health-wise and otherwise, that is interested in doing it, I think as a training center, we should try to make that available, and we should try to help the person through it safely and responsibly. To mandate that for every single person that wants to work in this space, I think that's difficult, given our current sort of the way we practice and supervise and teach and mentor medicine and psychology, psychiatry.
I agree, Rakesh. Yeah.
All right, thank you all. Moving on to our next question, which I think is equally as interesting. There are more and more underground networks of mycotherapy, psychotherapy groups working in the shadows as psychedelics becomes increasingly trendy in the media. Should the medical community discourage these groups, or is there a way to work with them to ensure that therapy is being done in an ethical and proper manner? I struggle with this. We can pretend they aren't operating, but they are, and I feel they can do a great deal of good for many people. I fear the potential for negative outcomes for others. Very interesting question. Anyone want to tackle that?
I can jump in, and this is an area extremely common in the veteran first responder space, and it's huge internationally. I mean, UK, US, Canada. It would be irresponsible for me not to say that we need to do things the right way. We need to do things responsibly. We need to have the research. We need to go through ethics boards. And I think part of it is there's a couple of reasons for it. One is that anything less of what we're trying to do can be dismissed as placebo effect, as anecdote. A guy went over there and told me he feels better now. We can't discount the people's suffering and how they feel, but to try to get into the mainstream, to get regulatory bodies to accept us, to get medical institutions to accept us, we need to have the literature, we need to have the science, we need to contribute, subject our studies to peer review, to get them into the journals that influence thought. So I just think I mean, I can't sit there and say, if people are doing it, they're doing it. Please do it safely. Please make sure that, people that have psychosis aren't getting psychedelics. I mean, be responsible doing it. But I think that it's not going to help us as a group to get to where we want to get, which is to have the governments, the regulatory bodies, the FDAs, the Health Canada, the EU, to kind of accept these as mainstream with the same standing as the traditional treatments. So you can tell I've thought about this one a little bit, but I really do feel people that are suffering. I got an email from a veteran in the UK that was suffering, and just say, hang in there, the science is coming soon. I know how difficult that is for me as a clinician to say to somebody, but I just think that if we're in it for the long haul, we need to convince people, and the only way to convince people is with data, ethically done research, irrefutable outcomes, and without that, we're going to just sort of simmer away and disappear for another 20 or 30 years.
I do. Is it okay to come in? I do hope that there's not a dichotomy that develops where there are those who work with the system in the way that Rakesh is describing and do things properly in a regulated way and build the evidence, and then those who sort of reject the system. It would be a shame if it binarizes in that way. There's likely to be a lot of experience and wisdom in those who've been operating outside of the system.
Absolutely.
So my hope is that they join and come into the system and put the merits of scientific process to what they're doing. They collect data. They do bother with certification and such like, and quality standards on medication and such like. That will make for a healthier rollout. Is it going to happen that way? I don't know, but I would hope that it does.
Yeah, Robin kind of touched on the 2 points that I see with that, just sort of framework of getting care to patients, is that one, I think the scalability as these things do move through normal sort of approval process, there's going to be a point where more patients are served by the protocols that have gone through FDA, et cetera, similar approval, that'll just be much more scalable at a certain point. That hasn't quite hit that tipping point, but that's definitely a factor. I think that's the, in 5 years, that's the way to get to the most patients with the most efficacy. Secondly, like Robin was mentioning, the issue of the quality of the drugs and what they're actually able to provide, I think is a huge one. I mean, these underground therapists are not compounding pharmacists, they're not drug chemists. And so, I think a lot of times they're getting what they think they can, but there's, all the black market issues with drug quality, purity, adulterants, et cetera. So I think that's a real safety issue that I'm concerned about. And so, I think this is where I see really the ability of the science to accelerate things forward. Like I was mentioning, as a aside to what Ruth was talking about earlier, that there's really a possibility of doing things like breakthrough therapy for some of these more severe conditions sooner. It's not an immediate solution. It's not, how can somebody have this next week, but that it might be, shorter than the next few years type thing. And so I really think that those types of solutions, playing within the system as aggressively and sort of as fast as possible, is the hybrid, sort of middle ground there that gets the most patients, the most access. But there's no perfect solution there. I mean, it'd be best to know everything immediately and be able to immediately provide it to patients, but that's just not the reality.
I know we're almost out of time, but I just want to knock out a few of these really quick ones before we end. Robin, this one's for you. I think it's referring to when you were talking previously about the double-blind study comparing psilocybin and blank. They're asking what was the name of the depression medicine?
Oh, sorry, I missed the last bit. We're talking about the double-blind RCT, and there's a question on that. Sorry.
Yeah.
What was the medication?
What was the medication?
It was escitalopram. 6 weeks of escitalopram, 10 milligrams for the first 3 weeks, 20 milligrams for the final 3 weeks.
Perfect.
Primary endpoint at 6 weeks.
Perfect. Thanks, Robin. And just running through these, where are the clinical trials currently occurring and what phases are they in? Rob, would you be the best person to answer this?
Yeah, so we have a number of trials. Effectively, I think the best thing to describe is, and I'll let Rakesh jump in and describe this pipeline in better detail. We're looking at PTSD as a focus across basically stage 2 clinical trials with an idea of looking at really, like was mentioned, the nuances of treatment. We as a company do have some other options that are under negotiation, et cetera, that are more mature than that, but it's not something I can release details on the call. So there's a number of other options, but I think a number of irons in the fire, I guess would be the best way to put it. But our prime focus is around the PTSD pipeline that we've laid out there, and then as we've announced as the first location in Leiden. So Rakesh, do you want to explain a little bit more about?
So we've got
PTSD?
just in the interest of time. So confirmed, Leiden University in the Netherlands. We do have 3 sites in Canada confirmed, and we're sort of having our first investigators meeting within the Canadians. Ruth is a PI in London, Ontario, the other London, Robin. And we have one in Alberta, Canada, and that one we're going to expand to veterans and first responders. And one in Ottawa, where I am at the Royal Ottawa Hospital, which is sort of a major center. We are very close to announcing 2 or 3 VA sites within the U.S. as well. So I'm working on that. So really, we're hoping for a presence in Europe and North America. And we have a presence in Europe and North America, but certainly the U.S. And I have a feeling we will end up in London at some point with all of our colleagues there. We've got too many friends in London not to sort of start doing some work there.
Thanks, Rakesh. And I think we are out of time at this point. Thank you guys all so much for joining. This has been a really great discussion. And thank you to the audience for sending in your questions and listening in. This has been really fun.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yeji, for moderating. Thank you so much to our wonderful audience and the group at Mydecine. We really appreciate having all of you. As a scientist myself, I love that discussion, and I really can't wait for the next one. So thank you for our audience. That was a lot of great questions, and we'll connect with you all again very soon. So have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Thanks, Yeji.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.